with many signifying the U.S. United States happen.
5, 4, 3.
We have stage 2 engine ignition. 1 minute 25 seconds. Change pressure hold. No
Can we have igniters work? And we have chamber ready to rise.
291 4229.
Hey guys, City Wall here, and welcome back to Mars. If you're new around here and you haven't seen episode 1 at the very least, I would recommend going back and checking that out. But just to give you a little bit of a quick recap, obviously this is Cities Skylines, the game, and we're playing like a very heavily modded version of the game in order to do some pretty awesome stuff that isn't really possible in the vanilla version. We're making a Mars colony on the surface of Mars inside of a really big glass dome. And it's a very, very small city and a very compact city, and a city with different sorts of levels. Like there's people who live down below and in sort of slums, and then there's really nice garden areas up above. The roads are conveyor belts. The public transportation is helicopters and cable cars. And as you maybe have been able to tell, this is sort of like a fantasy project. Like this is not meant to be scientifically accurate or what I think a future on Mars will look like. This is just an exercise in making an awesome looking city. So let's jump into this episode. If you recall, way back in episode 4, I spent a little bit of time working on a black market that was around the Central Sorting Exchange, and I said that the entire area around the Central Sorting Exchange would be markets and stalls and things like that, because that's the center of the city, like geographically. And so I wanted to continue working in that area to start off with. And first thing I did was place down a couple of these wet market buildings. And they were looking a little lonely. I put some billboards around the side, but then I was like, okay, what can I do to make these look cooler? And I started placing down apartment buildings like clipped together inside of these so that there were these like towers sticking up from the wet markets. And it's pretty cool, like in the gap between two of the towers, there's a conveyor belt that goes through, and in another gap, the cable car goes through, and the buildings are kind of shaped around the path of the cable car to give it enough room. I had to use the painter mod just to make sure that all of these buildings were the same color, because there's like 6 or 8 of them in each of the towers, and when you place down those buildings it just picks a random color for that building to appear as, so you want to make sure that they all match so that it looks like a single building. I wanted to create sort of like a walkway to connect these buildings like up above, and I used this station pedestrian overpass pack by Kaminogi, and these things are pretty cool, but I had to use procedural objects on them because they have these little legs sticking down, and I wanted to get rid of those, so you can do an awesome thing with procedural objects where you can just pick only the legs and then raise them up and put them inside of the rest of the walkway so that it appears that they're not there, which is pretty cool. I used procedural objects again because I wanted to do some really big signs on the sides of each of these towers. And there's these cool ones that kind of like dangle off the roof, and I made them absolutely massive so that they were like the same size as the building itself, and put one on each of the 3 buildings that are kind of facing towards this black market. And I think that particularly turned out really, really cool looking. There's one particular detail of this black market that I really, really liked that I added here, which I think adds like so much story to this place. I've downloaded a bunch of extra kind of like military men and military vehicles that I placed here like along the wall against like the central sorting facility. And I don't know the answer to this, but there's like these little boxes that they're kind of seem like they're delivering or picking up from this black market. You know, like, why is that? You know, like, what are these military men doing with like goods at this black market? You know, the answer to that is only something negative, I would guess. So I think that's pretty cool. I also did a little bit of work just sort of detailing this wall. I put some graffiti on it and used procedural objects to turn some of these like wire fences to be angled like 45 degrees, so it looked a little bit like there was barbed wire blocking someone from maybe like climbing up this wall. I put some lights both facing down and up. I think that adds kind of like a cool effect. The top of this wall, I still don't know exactly what I'm going to do with. I always figured that there would be something around the rim at the top of this, and I never have gotten to that or quite figured out what that's going to be. So eventually I'll add something to the top of this. This black market's going to be really big, and I think has a lot of opportunities for sort of different unique parts of it. So for this episode, we're going to move on, but we're definitely coming back here. If not in one episode in the future, maybe a few different episodes in the future. When I built the first upper island, you know, if you recall, I placed down a bunch of buildings on the lower level to kind of create a block and then build the upper level on the top of that block. And when I placed those lower buildings down, I was like, oh, this is like a really large amount of space. I couldn't possibly need more space, but when I actually did do it, it felt a little cramped up on that upper island. And this whole time I've been kind of thinking about how I could make an upper island that's bigger without having to make like a lower area block that was just like absolutely massive and kind of wasting a whole bunch of lower area space. And so what I decided to do was try and figure out a way to create an upper island that spanned over 2 blocks. So I just made a really quick and dirty version of the buildings on the lower parts of these 2 different blocks here, just like placing them down to just at least have like the shape and size of them. I went to the very, very edge of the map in an area that's like pretty flat, and where I could, like, if I ruined the terrain, I could pretty easily just flatten it back to how it was originally. And I took a sample of the height of the inside of the crater and lowered down a bunch of terrain over there to be the same height as the inside of the crater, so that I would have like an area like way off to the side as kind of like a work area where I wasn't going to be anywhere near the colony. And I used the Move It tool to select all those buildings that I had just placed down and copy a duplicate of them into this area so that I could have like a exact replica of the blocks that I was trying to build on top of, you know, over there. And so I took a screenshot of like the actual city and used this really simple program that comes with Microsoft that should just like draw lines over it. And then I went back to my kind of like work area, like way off to the side on the map, and attempted to copy that same shape using the railway siding pieces. And once I had that, I continued to use those railway siding pieces to make like a little hole in the center of the whole island, so that there was like an area that looked down onto this lower level street, or at least like gave some light down there. And then I used more railway siding pieces in order to make like second and third levels of this area. I want this to be like a multi-level island. Unlike the first one that I made, I want there to be stories built into this with like different heights and different things at different heights. So that center hole I made like bigger and bigger as it went up in levels, and added a few other little holes here and there. So the next step here was using the concrete platform pieces to make like a solid surface for this first level to sit on. And what I did was I took a few of those concrete pieces and turned a couple of them into procedural objects so that I could reshape them just a little bit. It was a lot harder to do this than it has been in other places, like especially on that first island, because the center of this island is also, there's not terrain underneath it. The center of this island goes over a street, so there's a lot more like precision placement of these that has to happen in order to get those concrete pieces to be, looking right going over that center street, and also to just be like avoiding going in blocking that hole that leads down to the center. So this was like a lot of procedural objects moving around the vertices trying to get these concrete blocks lined up properly and looking okay. And the kind of awful thing about that is it a little bit defeats the entire purpose, because when you turn these assets into procedural objects, they lose the ability to have props and trees snap to them. So this also made everything down the line harder and take longer. So at some point here, I placed down all the buildings that I thought could potentially go onto this island, and chose a couple of them and just placed them down. And really the only thing there was just making sure that those buildings were in the centers of the blocks below, so that the underneath parts of the buildings weren't like in the middle of the street or like showing in some way. So after I was done with that, the next step in the process was covering up everything with ploppable grass and ploppable pavement in order to make grassy areas and pathway areas. I used the network pavements for the most part because it's really easy to make nice smooth curves with those, and I wanted these paths to be very curvy. I'm also getting pretty worried about hitting the prop limit in this city before I finish the city itself, so every step along the process here, I've been selecting, all those surfaces or all the, props later on that I place down and turning them into procedural objects once I am done with them, so that those assets don't like count towards the prop limit. And procedural objects has this cool feature called layers, where you can create a layer and then assign like a big group of procedural objects to be that layer, and then you can turn on and off like the visibility of that layer as a whole, which has been kind of useful for this, because like as I get higher up in the levels of this area, like the second and third level, I can turn on and off the layers of procedural objects in order to be able to see down to the lower areas if I need to. So that's kind of cool. I placed down a number of little shops and things like along the pathways here. Some of the Monaco shops from the workshop, some Green Cities DLC, like little tents and market stalls and things like that. And then I started placing down a bunch of flowers and little grassy things all over this grassy area to make this whole entire area feel pretty jungly. These lower areas, for the most part, are going to be covered by the layer above them. So I'm thinking that these plants that are on the lower two levels are some kind of more like indoor type plants that don't want direct sunlight. And they're also not like trees for the most part. They're pretty low-lying plants. I'm a little bit worried about these plants going forward because there's trees and grassy things and flowers on multiple heights and on multiple levels. And if they ever get screwed up in any way, like they ever accidentally go to the wrong heights, like later on down the line in the city's history of building it, it's going to be really, really hard to figure out and separate, which ones go on which levels, because they're literally going to be directly on top of each other. So let's just hope that doesn't happen. I did save a version of this entire island, like off to the side of the, map in this working area that I'm just going to leave there in that event if that ends up happening, so that I can take all the trees from over there, delete the ones that I have in the city, and then copy them over. But hopefully that doesn't happen. So I'm really just going for the structure of this thing. I'm not placing down any props or lights or pedestrian pathways or anything like that. I'm going to do all of that work in a little bit here once I actually bring this whole island into the city. But for now, it's just kind of like getting the layout of it and the structure of it. So yeah, the next thing was doing the exact same process on the third and uppermost level. And, again, that's just placing down those elevated railway concrete props as sort of the base of it, the grass and pavement above, And for this level, there was a lot less pavement just because there's becoming less and less space as we get higher up. And then for the trees and the flowers and things, I kind of went with a slightly different set of trees and flowers for this upper level, just because I wanted it to feel like the levels below were sort of like indoor plants, like they needed shade, but these upper plants were kind of more like okay with direct sunlight, so they were maybe a slightly different variety of plants. And also a lot of like trees up here too, because at this height, you know, we're at the top, so the trees can be as big as they want. They're not blocked by anything. So this upper level has a bunch of palm trees and things, which makes this look particularly jungly, I think, too. And then the last thing that I did before I brought this whole entire area back into the city was I was noticing that these railway siding pieces, I didn't do a very good job at making sure that they were the right height. They don't really feel like railings like they do in some other places. So I wanted to add railings on top of this. And the easiest way to do that was I copied every single railway siding piece that I have in this whole area and pasted it back into my city, because you can actually only do this within the city limits. And I lowered them down to ground level and used the Avanya black iron fence to upgrade all of these railway siding pieces. And then so I could then copy those fences that I had now created in the exact same shape and replace them like directly on top of the railway siding pieces. So now there's like a really nice sort of decorative rim around each and every one of these levels and edges of the levels, which is pretty nice looking, I think. So, finally time to bring this thing actually into the city. I deleted almost every single one of the buildings on the lower levels, except for one, and my plan is to use that one in order to help me line up where exactly this island needs to go. So, I copied everything, every procedural object, every prop, every node, every segment, every building, and use the Move It tool to paste a new version of it into the city and use that one building in order to line everything up properly. And then once it was pasted, I could delete that duplicate building down below. And like I mentioned, I left that original version off to the side on the edge of the map just so that in the event that something catastrophic happened, I would have a backup of it, at least for the trees. That's the main thing I'm worried about. So now that it's actually in the city, the main things I have to do, now that I am in city limits, I can place down pedestrian pathways. I couldn't do that outside of the city limits. So place down a bunch of pedestrian pathways, and the strategy with this was I wanted to make them kind of loop around in a bunch of unnecessary ways so that these citizens would appear to be walking like all throughout this thing, even though it's not necessary that they do. So I kind of made a little bit of an extra paths that take people on pretty roundabout ways to get from point A to point B, just so I could see more people walking through here. I switched it to nighttime to kind of start placing down all the lights. And it took me quite a while to figure out the proper lights to use for this, because what I wanted was for these center parts to be lit up, but for the jungle part up above to still be dark. And placing down lights on like kind of the ceiling of the second level, you know, a lot of these lights are very harsh and make like very specific looking like spotlight shapes on the levels below, and I didn't want that. I wanted it took a second to find the right lights to light this up properly. So once I did, I placed down a bunch of those, which ended up looking really, really cool. My hope is that people will walk up onto this third level because it's what's actually connected to the helicopter stop that I made, and this thing's pretty cool. I used one of the Ronix 69 expressway pillars and made it way bigger using procedural objects, and also made the shape of it kind of like a cone shaped so that it was really, really tall and started off really skinny at the bottom. It got thicker at the top and had like a circular helipad at the very top. So once this was actually in the city, I was able to take one of those invisible blimp stops and hide it kind of like inside of this pillar and hook it up to the rest of the helicopter blimps in the city. And now there's some passenger helicopters that come and land here and pick people up and drop people off, which is kind of cool. And then the last thing was just connecting up this area to the first island. So I had to delete some networks and move some things around in order to make the pathways kind of like look seamless, you know? There was some minor detailing that I also did at the very end. There was this one spot where I had originally been planning on having like a really tall tree poking through these kind of two holes leading down to lower and lower levels. But once I actually saw how it looked, that tree just became totally irrelevant because of all the other trees on that third level. So I deleted the tree and I covered up that second level hole to just make it only one hole at the very, very top, and had concrete directly below it so that it lit up a little bit nicer and was a little bit more of an accentuated area as opposed to just like looking like more jungle, which I didn't really like. So at this point, I didn't work in Mars for like a week and a half because I have someone working in the city. But during that time, I was loading into the game and experimenting with some assets and doing some things. And I was noticing that looking at this upper area dropped my frames per second by like 10. Like I was at like 35 frames per second, like looking anywhere else in the city. But if I got close to this thing, it was down to like 20, 25. And that's because trees and bushes and flowers and things have a lot of tries that make up the model. They're very complicated little tiny models, and having like 5,000 or 10,000 little tiny flowers and things here like I have just sucks up the frame rate. So what I decided to do was, since I was already worried about these plants and things, just to go a different route with the detailing. And obviously I could have gone back and changed the episode leading up to this point right now, but I thought it would just kind of be cool to see the thought process and the process of trying different iterations of this island to get to a final product. One of the things that I was thinking when I first came up with the shape of this island was that it would be really cool to have like fountains on each level and have water like falling down to each one. And in that interim 8 days, the animated waterfall asset by Kaminogi came out, and so it was just perfect. I had to do that. And so I deleted all the trees and then just started placing down the Peking Union Medical College wall, I think that's what it's called, as sort of like the edges of pools, like koi pond type water pools for like fish to be swimming around and lily pads and things like that. And I did a similar technique to mimic the shape where I copied the Avanya fence over to another area and upgraded the fence to the wall, and then brought that wall back. And then started placing some decals like on the bottom of these pools. And I used procedural objects for that because I wanted the decals to be in very specific shapes, and with procedural objects you can only use like little bits of a decal. You don't have to use the entire thing, and so you can be very precise about where it's placed. And then there's the Ronix pool pack, which I have subscribed to, and that comes with this like secret hidden prop that is used to make the surface of the water for each of those pools. It's kind of like a see-through sort of like water textured square. And so I used that a bunch to kind of make like the surface of these pools. And that was also a lot of procedural objects being very particular and precise about their placement and making sure they're not overlapping and making sure that the textures weren't getting scrunched or squeezed or stretched too much. I found this lotus plant that if you use the tree and vehicle props mod by Electrics, you can turn that lotus plant into a procedural object and then scale it down so that it fits kind of nicer. And so that's what I did. I placed a bunch of lotus plants down and kind of was strategic about their placement, covering up some of the like ugliness of the pool texture below it. And then there's these koi fish props assets that are really interesting because some of them are animated, but some of them come as trees, but they look like fish. And the reason that they do that is because trees sway in the wind. And so with the tree and vehicle props mod, again, you can turn those, tree fishes into procedural objects and make them way bigger, because that's sort of the issue that I was having with them, is that the fish are extremely tiny in the regular version of these assets. So placed a bunch of fish down that hole that I was talking a little bit ago about how I didn't want a tree there. Now that it's surrounded by pond, I thought a tree would be really cool there, so I put a tree back. I used the Electrics Road Tools mod in order to add a couple extra nodes to these Peking Union Medical College walls, so that I could make a very, very short segment and then delete that segment, and then have like waterfalls falling from an upper level to a lower level, like in that kind of area where there's no siding to the pool. I put a really big waterfall that kind of comes out of like this sort of black square slot shaped thing on the side of one of these buildings. So that's kind of like where, the whole entire pool is getting filled up from. And I'm imagining there's some sort of pump, that pumps water from the lower level back up into that very top waterfall. And then I switched focus to kind of like detailing the rest of this upper area. And I wanted to make sure that I was going to do something that was going to be much better on the FPS than my first attempt. I placed down some little mulch circle curb things by Lord Grooney and had some trees in the middle of them, and then started placing down a ton of manicured grass decals. And I did that same trick again where I turned them into procedural objects in order to make them very specific shapes, so that they wouldn't do that sort of weird texturing thing that they sometimes do when they are near or on top of network fences and retaining walls and things like that. I have this pack of bollards, and one of them is like just basically a sphere, and I scaled that way up and kind of made that be sort of like the theme of the decoration of this island. So I have like a couple different spheres like around the place that are different sizes, and I did a little random detailing here and there. Like I added an area with some tables and chairs that was maybe like an outdoor restaurant and little things like that. But the main thing that was just left that I still did here was I created a little custom asset that's a pack of 4 different animated and glowing string light props. And I used the exact same technique that I did last episode with the animated walk into street sign. So there's 4 different versions. There's flickering, there's twinkling, there's sort of like a wave one, and there's one that's just always on. And then I placed down some kind of like pillars and put a bunch of these string lights going between pillars, like around each of the levels, around the rims of each of the levels, like above the ponds, and then also around the rim of the entire island itself on the top level. And I think that was really the cherry on top for this whole area. I think that really brought it all together. The last thing that I worked on this episode was just detailing some of the areas underneath this upper island so that I could get some good looking, cinematic shots of this whole area where you could really see from the upper level to the lower level. And so one of the things that I did kind of stylistically was similar to that like favela that I made in episode 6. I basically started like stacking a bunch of these shantytown assets on top of kind of more large and normal looking buildings. So it was kind of like the normal building was built and then there wasn't enough space and people just started like building shacks sort of like on top of each of these normal buildings. On the ground level, kind of like behind this cable car hub and near the black market, I made this cool little area that's maybe like sort of an outdoor, I don't know, maybe they do like plays or like announcements or like speeches, things like that here. There's like some benches situated around like a campfire. That street that goes underneath the upper island, that's kind of like a tunnel basically. I did a little detailing. I put quite a few kind of glowing and animated signs on the sides of the buildings. And in between the buildings in the middle of the street, I put quite a bit of trash just like in the middle of the street. and just kind of like generally made it so that if I was looking through that hole that's in the center of this upper island, it would be like really grimy and terrible looking down there. It's like a huge contrast to what's directly above it. So that was kind of the goal of that, making that like hole in the center of this thing from the get-go, was to have that crazy contrast, and I think that really succeeded. So I just wanted to thank you guys all again for your support making this project and for watching the videos in the first place, especially to my patrons who, without you guys, I definitely wouldn't be able to justify spending as much time doing this as I have been. If you want to support the project and want to see like 1, 2, 3, something like that, episodes in advance, or you want access to the save game and want to play around in the city, or you want to see or use some of the models and assets that I made before they come out, head over to Patreon. The link is in the description. This episode was super long, so depending on how you look at it, I'm sorry, or you're welcome. And that's it for this episode, so I'll see you all next time on Mars.